My name is Amy Barron. I'm the director of I Was Supposed to Have a Baby. We are an organization that typically focuses on infertility and pregnancy loss and the struggle that individuals and families have in the Jewish community, the struggle to have a child. And a lot of the work that we do is what we call sort of sensitivity training. We train the individuals and the couples to figure out how to talk about their struggles and how to talk about their individual situation to their friends and family members, to help them to understand, to help them to ask for the things that they need and to be able to receive the things that they need from the people that love them. And we also spend a lot of time really addressing the community at large. What we do is we do lots of posts and stories, and we have different commentators and interviews with people to share the experience of what this is like and talk about what it feels like and what things feel warm and nurturing and sensitive and what things really feel off-putting and really make people feel triggered and make them feel disappointed in others when they really just wanted hope and support and respect. And so this series, this lecture series, which is now the fourth in a 4-part series, is meant to bring these kinds of sensitivity discussions more to the community at large and talk about things that are a little bit beyond the infertility and loss community, but talk about larger global issues that people are struggling with, so we can all learn to be a little bit more sensitive and a little bit more compassionate. And so our first lecture focused on general infertility, grief, and loss. Our second lecture focused on chronic illness, mental illness, body image, and eating disorders, and also disabilities. Our third lecture really focused on the single community and the divorce community. And now here we are at the fourth lecture. And we created this entire series to talk about what we thought was going to be post-pandemic. Like we thought we were all going to be over COVID. And this group of individuals, specifically, Avital, Rabbi, Marc, and Chava, were brought in, I somehow coerced them, to basically come into this discussion and speak as community leaders as to sort of this top-down thinking of, we've all been through a lot, and now that's over. And so, like, how do we come back to normal and be sensitive to our communities as we're coming back to normal? But when I had these discussions, these first discussions with these unbelievable individuals, that was back in May or June, when we all thought the vaccine and other pieces that were going on in the world were going to be this panacea of normalcy, and we were going to be in a very much different place. Unfortunately, with the Delta variant and who knows how many other variants that are abound at this point, and vaccine effectiveness sort of waning, we've realized that the pandemic, or maybe I should just say coronavirus, is really here to stay. And the question is, how do we deal with all of that? And what were all of our communities like before this? How have we managed the 18 months? And now what do we do looking forward? And so I'm turning to all of you and saying, our discussion that we thought we were going to have a few months ago is very different now. And so let's now have this conversation and let's talk about what this has looked like and how each of your communities has sort of weathered the situation. So Avital, I'm going to come to you first, just because you're alphabetically listed first on the flyer.
Sure.
Welcome. First of all, just give people an introduction to who you are if they don't know you already. And to each of you, the question is, what were your communities like? What were the sensitivities and the different pieces that were the struggles in your community? Can you share a little bit about that prior to the pandemic?
Sure. First of all, thank you so much for having me. It's a real pleasure to join tonight. It feels kind of meta to have this conversation because I feel like I'm really living in this total anxiety and uncertainty about the future, but it's therapeutic as well. So thanks for that. A little bit about myself. I am a journalist. I've sort of been publishing in various mainstream publications over the years. I was most recently an editor at The Forward, and before that, I was a reporter at Haaretz. Now I'm just sort of focusing on freelancing, and I'm working on a book. And in my spare time, I moonlight as a rebbitzin. So on weekends and evenings and most spare moments, I am sort of involved in my husband's community work in Manhattan's Upper East Side. So to your question about problems before the pandemic, well, every community likes to say that we were perfect. But I think that honestly, it's really hard to think back to what those problems were like, because now I kind of think they're adorable. But though I guess they would be sort of encapsulated by one thing, and it's, I think, very common among any urban community, is that it's really hard to sort of maintain that feeling of constant cohesiveness between members in an urban setting. People sort of are members of various shuls and they hop around, or they're not members of any and they just come, wherever they want. It's very transitory. You have a lot of people coming through the city, young people especially, sort of living here for a few years and then moving on to greener pastures. So it's sort of, it's hard to figure out like who is our core audience, so to speak, when we're figuring out what programming we need to do. And also I say this as a community volunteer, not an employee, but it is a little bit painful when inevitably many of these people decide to leave. And it's sort of like, we invested so much and it's really hard to say goodbye to you. So those were sorts of the main challenges, but I think they're not unique for our shul. They're all across, any city community.
Yeah, I think that's, and I would say regular communities that I think are transitory communities, also not necessarily city or urban based, but any communities that sort of people think of as starter communities, yeah. Or yeah, exactly. Okay, Marc, please introduce yourself and share a little bit about the world in which you come from.
Sure. Hello, everyone. Name Marc Fein, originally from Riverdale. So shout out to all the Riverdale people who are listening to this call. And my world, moved to Israel 2 years ago. Work as a mental health advocate, a coach. Fun fact: starting a new job this week. Hopefully, stay tuned for that. And I run a summer program for NCSY. And I would say some of the communities that I've been a part of would be we'll call it the OLEG community, the singles community, the mental health community. And the reason why I share all those identities is because I think what they all have in common, especially pre-corona as a challenge, and wait if any of this sounds familiar post-corona, a sense of isolation. A sense of, okay, where exactly do I belong and where am I establishing myself and who are my people and where can I find them? And a lot of questions similar to what Avital was saying of transience. Where am I now? Where am I going? What does next look like? And where exactly is my base? And who are the people that get me and understand me? I think were a lot of the questions that people in those communities were sort of working through or working with pre-corona. And all of those obviously have been exacerbated, to put it mildly, over the course of the pandemic.
Yeah, thank you. I'm so glad that you're here because you bring this piece that we touched on in our last lecture, but it's important to revisit it and discuss it again and weaving the other pieces as well. So I'm so glad that you're here to bring voice to that too. Thank you. Rabbi Zaya.
Yeah, thank you so much. Dr. Amy, and it's really a pleasure to be here with each of you for this time together. For me, Isaiah Rothstein, I'm originally from Muncie, New York. I was born and raised in a mixed race Chabad family that really, in many ways, my teenage rebellion was becoming modern Orthodox. I started attending NCSY programs when I was in 6th grade. I had payas until I was like about 10, and then I stopped going by Shia and started going by Isaiah. And a whole backdrop to like my upbringing was me and my friends, we being raised with shuls everywhere. We hung out in the woods, and we hung out at the mobile gas stations, and we hung out at the 7-Elevens. And we could keep up. We were raised culturally Orthodox. We were in the community, but we were Muncie rebels. And everything I do today, everything that calls me to this work is very much my ancestry, being very much connected to America and to the diaspora narratives of the Jewish people. And then also thinking about how I was raised. And so even Dr. Amy, how you even opened up about like what kind of questions we ask about the structures of our communities and sensitivities, like that's already like huge compared to how I feel like I was raised, where the norms were 1 or 2 or 3 ways of engaging, and then everything else was left to the woods and to 7-Eleven and to the mobile gas stations. And so in that way, it's a gift to be together. Prior to the pandemic, I wasn't working at Jewish Federations of North America. I was working for Chazon, the Jewish Lab for Sustainability. It's one of the I think it's the largest faith-based environmental organization in North America. And my job was to steward rabbis and spiritual leaders. And when I would call them and ask them, about how they engage around climate justice, they would say, well, we don't have bandwidth. Like, we're focusing on this issue, we're focusing on that issue, we have a task force for this issue. And it was really like through that work that I started to think more about systems and social change, like, within society and culture change. And I guess what I would say about prior to the pandemic versus now, at least this is just personally for me, when I think about Jewish outreach and Jewish inreach, the deep need within our communities, I think about the fact that we only engage about 35% of American Jewry, and that 65% mostly engage outside of Jewish life altogether. And then so where are people going from Muncie to thinking about American Jewry and then everything in between? I think what people were already looking for a person-centered approach. People were already looking for a sense of belonging, and I think the pandemic just only amplified that even more. And now this round 2, or wherever we're holding, is only amplifying that even more. And I think I'm curious about our trajectory coming out of the pandemic.
So you're saying that if I'm understanding you correctly, that you feel that the pandemic reinforced people's connections to Judaism and to Jewish community, or it distanced them?
I mean, I would say that the pandemic only like further reminded us of just how many people might be in need, and having, we already have many different orbits. Each of us have our own orbits of how we live our lives. And I think that was already an issue. Like, I think we're already, the data about America, Gen Z being one of the loneliest generations on record, or, and also like, and for the positive, there's so many positive things, but I think it reinforced that there's a lot of people who are experiencing the world very differently in disparate ways, and that maybe our community and the structures maybe not holding us.
Got it. Okay. Okay, we need to come back to that. Because I think it ties very much into some of the pieces that we want to get to here, but I want to make sure everybody has a chance to speak. Chava, please introduce yourself and share a little bit of your Torah.
Sure. So my name is Chava. I have predominantly worked in issues of racial inclusion and racial equity within Jewish space, primarily in pluralistic circles, because it was a conversation that wasn't really happening in Orthodox communities. However, that's one thing that I think has shifted in this pandemic, which led to the founding of Kamocha, which is an organization that really kind of centers the experience of and the voices of Black Orthodox Jews, and kind of reaches out to the broader Orthodox community to talk about issues of race and racial equity and racial inclusion. But really, for me, kind of the community that, I guess, for purposes of this conversation, that I represent are kind of Jews of color, Black Orthodox Jews. And I think that one thing pre-pandemic, there were feelings of isolation, there were feelings of just being unseen, right? I think for a large part of Orthodox Jews of color, particularly Black Orthodox Jews, it's just, you didn't exist, right? Before this pandemic, we just were not here. We didn't exist for most people in the community, which I think led to, being considered oddities when you are in from space, whether it's kosher restaurants or from stores or yeshivot. And really, there was this constant kind of pushing to be seen and to be accepted and to be seen as a member of Klal Yisrael, right? And I think it's a really interesting moment and intersection, because at the same moment we have this crisis of a communal pandemic, we also have this incredible racial justice movement, awakening, whatever you want to call it. And so it becomes a conversation that is on the forefront of our community. And I think it's been happening in a bunch of ways that both reinforce kind of the feelings of isolation. In a lot of times, those conversations on race and racism in the Orthodox community are happening without us, with the assumption that we aren't there. And then there's also this new, I think, recognition and realization that there are people of color in our community. And so how do we as a community, how do we respond to that awareness? What does it mean for us in our institutions? Can they look the same? Can they feel the same? Can we continue operating just exactly the same and having that speak to everyone and speak for everyone? And so I'm really excited about the development that these conversations are happening in this pandemic. But again, and I think it kind of also mirrors the pandemic, where we have, we're in crisis mode, and therefore we're really concerned and we're vocal and we want to do things and we want to engage and we want to act. And it's crisis moment, right? Where, this is when we're davening, we're all taking on mitzvot, this, that, or the other thing, we're all having panels and speaking engagements, and I want to bring you here and I want to bring you there. But then it doesn't end, right? Like the crisis doesn't end. So where do we go from there? And I think that's kind of the moment that we're in, both with the conversation around race in our community, and then also kind of at this intersection and inflection point with COVID and how we relate to each other.
I mean, you basically just summed up this entire talk. So I think we can be done now. But no. Yes, that's exactly, that's exactly it. There's so much that has been happening and will continue to happen because COVID is not over. And the question is how do we move forward, and how do we make this sensitivity, these conversations, as part of our norm, right? So let's talk a little bit more about that piece. Marc, I'm going to come to you first. Like, you touched upon some of these, the ideas about isolation, about feeling loneliness. I mean, many of you have, because of the different communities that you represent. Can you just hone in a little bit more on what the experience was like when everything started to fall apart last year, and how that has shifted into the now? I mean, because now we're still very much in the thick of it, even though we thought this was going to be finished.
Yeah, so I'm laughing and giggling because sometimes the option is either laugh or cry, and sometimes both. And I feel like that's just been the experience both before and during. And I think Chava articulated it beautifully about the transition from crisis to, we'll call it normal or back to normal. But that doesn't mean that all the things that were a challenge beforehand don't exist anymore. Like, again, I'm thinking back to Pesach. And then we had that whole movement around what we call pick up the phone, and all the people who are going to be isolated for Chag.
Explain that a little bit.
Yeah, so basically, there's a movement called pick up the phone before Pesach, because we recognize it's going to be a 3-day yontif. People are going to be isolated in their homes. That could have significant mental health impacts on them. And we started a movement for people who are volunteering to pick up the phone on Chag. And all of a sudden, there's this big conversation about who's going to be isolated and who's checking up on people. And halachically, what does that mean in terms of mental health? What can we do? What can't we do? And it was a great communal conversation. And now that we're heading back for Rosh Hashanah, a lot of the people who were isolated before are still isolated. The same conversation isn't happening. And all the people who were isolated last Pesach were probably also isolated the previous Pesach. And that conversation as a community wasn't happening. And I think to Chava's point, the metaphor that comes to mind is like that of a rubber band. It's like, okay, like we stretched and now we're starting to come back. And the question becomes, well, how do we keep that momentum and sensitivity going without the crisis and all the agita that comes with, oh, it's a crisis, therefore we need to respond. And there are some things that are still happening, like Blue Dove Foundation just put out a lot of mental health resources for the high holidays. Rav Yoni Rosenzweig put out a mental health and halacha booklet and pamphlet. I see popping up on Facebook individual rabbis talking about mental health and anxiety, and that's phenomenal on these, we'll call it individual activist levels, I like to call it, as opposed to what Rabbi Zaya was describing of, okay, on a communal level and a structural level, now that we have been forced to acknowledge because of the pandemic that this community exists, we can't now pretend that this community doesn't exist. So what are we going to do about it? And I think the natural human reaction is, okay, we want the crisis to be over, meaning in this case, the pandemic. And now everything that is associated or we associate with a pandemic, we want that to be over also. And it's what I like to call peekaboo politics. As long as they don't look at it, it doesn't exist. As long as they don't look at it, it doesn't exist. And I think there's a very natural desire to want to go back to, as long as you don't look at it, it doesn't exist. And part of the role of panels like this and the people on this panel is, how do we keep the conversation and the visibility to the forefront, and not in a, although sometimes it will be a confrontational way, but in a reminder and holding up a mirror that, okay, a lot of stuff was revealed and now we get to continue to figure out on a communal level and structural level how to deal with this, because it was real. And it wasn't because of the pandemic. It was always real. It just happens to be the pandemic revealed that there are some real fissures and isolations and ignoring that was happening in the community that we now get to figure out how to deal with in a productive and meaningful way.
Yeah, I think we in our planning meeting, we talked about this like compassion fatigue and battle fatigue, right? Like we talked about this a lot, about how we, everybody went rah, 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 rah in the beginning. And now we're like, oh, we need to do this again. But yes, we need to keep doing this and doing this again, because it's not as if, exactly what you said, it's not as if the problem has disappeared. Rav Isaiah. Unmute. We have to do that at least once during every single program. We know, right? So I'm just like, thank you for being like Yotze for us. Thank you.
Yeah, for real. Yeah, one thing that Marc struck for me, is like I'm not sure to laugh or to cry, and I think that like we're even coming into the Chagim, like that's the energy of the Chagim, and there's a lot of deep Torah on like even Yitzchak and the Akeda, the word Yitzchak meaning laughter, but also if you flip the letters, it's Kate's Chai, the end of life and laughter, and holding this, dip the apple in the honey with judgment, and even the Tehillim that we say and the different customs that we have leading up to the Chagim, holding like these two realities. And for me, like I also look to Avital, just because I think that when there's the most immediate needs of a community that's like topless, like right now, like foundational things, I have a privilege to think about structures and systems and trajectories and culture change and tact, like, and it's a different headspace than when someone is literally calling you in desperate need for something immediate as a response. But when I think on the note of the structural issues, that those take place over time, right? And the pandemic, what it has done for us is it's given us a moment to actually pause and to have a disruption and going through however we've been building community, like in the business of racial justice and equity, and any conversations around equity, diversity, and inclusion, they're identity-based, and have the structures of our community create spaces for us to process our identities, right? Where that's actually built into school, and that takes place over time, where we wake up one day and we maybe don't even have the kalim to have conversations because we weren't necessarily given that. So when I think of this disruption and then what we want to build for the future, I'm thinking about what kind of spaces that we want to build, what's coming into the world now. And yes, like the fatigue, the stamina that's needed to want to see our culture change and social change. I learned from this guy, Daryl Connor, that 70% of social change agents fail. They want to see something take place, 70% fail. They get fatigued, they don't necessarily see a way out. That's on the broader systems. But then what about us as just individuals, right? To believe in myself, to believe that I could even just what's in front of me today, not necessarily these big global and cosmic things. I think that's another piece of the puzzle. So it's both believing. With this, I'll pause, but I'm just thinking through, like, when it comes to living with a redemptive lens or a Mashiach lens, we say that we're not supposed to have fatigue. That even if Mashiach delays, we like keep strong. But then we also acknowledge through every single ritual that we do that we're in gullus, that we're not whole, and that we're a little piece of us is broken. So for society and us also as individuals, how are we able to hold that? Yeah, it's okay to have fatigue. It's okay to sleep it off. It's okay to hold back in certain moments. And also we're on this journey for the generation.
Right. It's the push and the pull, the yin and the yang of I often talk about like the grief and the joy, and Marc was saying this too. I don't know whether to laugh or cry. Like we can hold the yearning and the longing with the with the pieces that we need to feel now, the pain and the anguish. We can hold all of those two things together. That's effectively what you're saying. Like the compassion fatigue is okay, as long as we don't lose sight of what the goal is. Okay, trying. Avital, thoughts?
You know, it's so different. All of our roles in the community are so different. And to be honest, you know, coming back to your original question about challenges in the beginning in the thick of the pandemic, I mean, it's sort of, my answer is going to be obvious. I think most clergy and clergy families were really busy at the time in spring of 2020 with really basic existential questions. So the decision to shut down was, you know, at the time felt huge, and now we're sort of like, well, obviously, but you know, that was emotionally very taxing. And then of course, illness and death. And I don't, you know, I think rabbinic families are, you sort of go through the roller coaster, the emotional roller coaster of life cycles at an extremely not normal pace, right? A normal person sort of experiences their own life cycles at the times that they happen, but we sort of go through literally everything almost daily. Someone's born, someone dies, someone at a bar mitzvah, someone's getting married, someone's getting divorced, etc. So we're sort of used to it. You know, I posted once a picture of my husband's shoes one Sunday. One was splattered with mud from a graveyard. He had just buried someone, and the others were shined and ready to go to the wedding that we had that night. And that's sort of like, that's the life really of community work. So we're sort of used to it, but the pandemic was something else, obviously. And I think it was very traumatizing. There's sort of been some conversation, at least of what I'm seeing amongst the Rebbitzins conference discussion about sort of kind of like a PTSD that a lot of people went through. You know, when you're so up close to that illness and death, that people, you know, are calling you. We had people calling who were not even members, but were relatives of members and had no synagogue and had no rabbi, and suddenly someone died, and what do they do? And the body's in another state, and the morgue is not answering, and the undertaker's overwhelmed. And it was a really, really, really terrible and taxing time, which I don't know how much like we've really processed, you know, we sort of just kept going. But sometimes I take a pause to think about what we've gone through, and it shocks me. So our challenges were really basically existential. I mean, there were obviously, you know, getting food to the homebound, people who really could not leave the home to get any provisions. And then there were sort of these larger questions about, about
Life.
Essentially, well, spirituality, right? People did not, you know, there was this search for answers that we saw from all sorts of people in the community, like, why is God doing this? And how do we deal with it? And how can we stay connected? There was an interesting, I think, in some ways, there was a spike of interest in Jewish learning remotely. People were sort of like, well, now I finally have time. Now I'm not constantly flying around the world making business deals. I have time to sit and learn. But I think overall, I think that kind of faded away. And I think in general, people kind of feel not fatigued as much as just like jaded, and like it's just so hard to maintain connection virtually. So that's sort of been the ongoing issue, I would say.
Do you think that, I guess now sort of bringing it forward, and this is really for all of you, and I'm gonna, Avital, do you need to answer that, or do you?
No, that's fine.
Okay. I'm like, welcome to real life. We're all doing this virtually at home. The question, I mean, we spoke a lot about like what this means going forward, and how do we be sensitive? How do we be kind? How do we understand what others have been going through, and yet know that we ourselves as community leaders and figureheads, we we also were tired, and as you just said, like, we haven't processed all the difficult things that have gone, that have happened over the last number of months, years. And so how do we continue giving, and how do we still bring our A game to everyone? I mean, what are your thoughts about that? I remember we talked, you brought up this concept of like the Hilchos Corona, of the like being respectful to the people who are here and there. So I wanted you to talk a little bit more about that piece too.
Yeah, I mean, regarding that, I was just sort of, joking that we have people who are more machmir and more makel on Corona, and you sort of have to respect everyone's lines and not ask questions. Obviously, as long as you're not sort of endangering yourself, I think, or others. So yeah, I mean, we have people who have literally not left their summer homes for a year and a half. Their children have been on remote school for the entire over a year by choice. They are terrified. Like, if they could have drones deliver their groceries, they would. And we have people who are sort of early into the pandemic, kind of like, it's just, it's not a big deal. We got to learn to live with it. And everyone in between. My husband always says that in one day he can get someone walking into his office saying, Rabbi, you're Rothstein, you're murderers, you're doing Shul, or you're crazy. And then the next person comes in and says, Rabbi, this whole thing is a hoax, like COVID doesn't exist. And that's, the reality is sort of dealing with all those extremes. So we sort of, we've kind of like learned to just try to stay away as much as possible from getting into those conversations. Like, policy is the policy, right now, but obviously vaccination is the big discussion. For the most part, thankfully in Manhattan, it's not a debate. So we are grateful for that. In terms of giving, I mean, I feel that I'll be honest, I don't feel qualified to answer that, because I don't think I'm a paragon of that. I actually wrote about this kind of early in the pandemic, this feeling of like, I barely have my own oxygen mask on. I can't even think about like, doing what I feel compelled to do in the community. I just don't have that strength. And I am sad to say that I kind of still feel that way. It's been really, really difficult to sort of just manage everything. And I can't say, I mean, I do a lot, but I always feel like I could be doing more. And this feels like therapy. I feel like,
dozens of, your closest friends. It's
all fine. No, I'm being honest. Like, I don't feel like I'm doing enough. Like, I really feel like I should be giving more shiurim, but I don't have the emotional capacity right now to do that, on a regular basis as often as I would like to. So I don't know what the answer is. I mean, we sort of try to find the things that mean something to us. So obviously shiurim is something that I love to do, but it requires, I think, more time than I have. But one other thing that we've really been investing into is sort of hosting Shabbat meals in our home. And that has been sort of trying to bring people back together, sort of on a very small level, very intimate, and that has been really beautiful. So I host both Shabbat meals, dinner and lunch every week, a large table, and that's my main focus, because I really believe in the power of just sitting with others, breaking bread together, having those conversations, and reconnecting. People have not seen each other literally for 2 years, pretty much. So that's been my focus, but I don't know. I feel like this is going to sound self-pitying, but I almost feel like I wish people understood the stress and the pain that people in communal work have gone through this past year. Like everyone has gone through a very, very difficult time. But when you're bearing the burden of community, you're bearing thousands. For us, it's around 1,000 families are sort of on our shoulders, we feel, and it's a lot of emotional energy. And I almost wish people were a little bit more forgiving, were sort of like just like, you know, they wouldn't judge us so quickly, sort of like, well, you know, why didn't she call me back? Or why didn't she answer me or something? Well, because there are like 10 other people trying to get a hold of me at that time.
Yeah, look, that's the reason why we're having this conversation. I mean, among others, but to be open and honest and share the different facets of this, that as much as all of us are trying to give, and because we each have these roles, we're all still people, and we're only one person with the capacity to do what one person can do, even though many of us take on roles which care for, as you said, thousands of others. So this is the place for it. This is the place for it. Thank you. I look, it's welcome to therapy. What can I say?
I think
Chava.
even saying that, by the way, just like about the therapy piece, I love that you're just like, I mean, half joking, half serious, whatever. Like, yeah, like we really need that, right? To make that even the space that we, even people who are in leadership positions who are holding together communities with 1,000 families, like, yeah, we all need support in different ways, and like this space is a space like that. So thank you for creating it, you know?
Look, yeah, give us, I very much like, I'm a person that also holds a lot of feelings and a lot of emotions in my community. And so a lot of the work that I do tends to be outward. So this work felt very selfish for me. So thank you for joining me on my group therapy session. Chava, what are your thoughts about all this, about the everything, the group therapy?
So for me, I think that even like the founding of Kamocha was part of me creating a structure for the community that I needed, right? I was getting a lot of phone calls because I think it was interesting, right? We had this moment initially where I was one of those people who were like, I can't believe I can't go to Shul. What am I going to do? And then like we had this racial justice moment where I was like, oh my gosh, Baruch Hashem, I am not in Shul, because I am not ready to like face some of these people like in actual real life right now. And you know, had to say like on community WhatsApps, like, hey, I just want to let you know there's like a Black Jew on this chat. So like, let's just, I'm just gonna make you aware of that. So I was getting a lot of phone calls and fielding a lot of conversations with people who were like, you know, I don't know where I fit in this community anymore. Maybe this is like a sign that I shouldn't be here, or that I should take my family and move or leave or pull my kid out of yeshivot. And so when, you know, and there's always been kind of like informal structures where people were kind of providing people with chizuk and, you know, just sharing some guidance and advice. And I started to kind of get a lot of the same conversation. And I was like, you know what, we need to put together something that feels a little bit more formal, something that feels strong enough to give people both kind of like the validation that they need to kind of deal with the circumstances that they're dealing with, and also something to be an advocate for our like people in our position, for people to be able to have this conversation, to be a part of conversations in our community, so that it doesn't become, you know, an exodus, right? And so part of it for me was having like organized like Rosh Chodesh virtual gatherings of other Black Orthodox Jewish women who could talk about like what's going on and how are we feeling about this like crazy moment in our communities, and how there is unfortunately it was like a solace in not being together. And then what do we do with that? Like how do we wrestle with those feelings about a community we love and a Torah we love, but like feeling very much isolated and disconnected. And then also kind of maintaining a point of connection so that we could still have like rahmanis for other people. I think that what has happened when we've gone into like these virtual spaces, we're no longer real people to each other, right? We have become positions and policy positions and political positions. And, it's how we get to this point where, I refuse to be in a mask because, I don't care if you get sick, or if you get sick and you're unvaccinated, I don't care. And it's like, where's the Rahmanis for like each other? We're in this period of like Elul, and we're moving into Tishrei, where we're going to be asking for like Hashem to have Rahmanis on us, like to really think about kind of where we need to do tshuva and how we relate to each other. And I think that part of that is coming to a realization that like we're more than the people who agree with us, the people who disagree with us, the people who the system always worked for. I mean, the reality is the system, the culture, the community works for people. If it didn't, like, it would have changed, right? There are people it works for. And I think what happened when COVID first hit was people who the system always worked for became uncomfortable, right? It was a period of discomfort and like isolation in a way that they had never experienced. And so, of course, like the community could put together all of its resources because we were all now feeling that discomfort, that isolation, that anxiety, right? And now I think we're moving back to a place where only some of our community is still stuck in that place of isolation and discomfort and anxiety. And so what do we bring, like Marc was talking about, like what do we bring from those initial moments where we were all feeling that together? What do we bring into that energy? How do we start to advocate for some of the structural, changes that Isaiah was talking about that might not change our community tomorrow, but put in kind of like the things that force us to have continual Rahmanis for people who are feeling isolated, who are feeling, who are in that place where, there's something that the community is still needs to do more work for them, and I think that that's kind of where we are. And I think that that's going to be the challenge, is like, how do we in our own, and I always say like we all have like powers of influence, like how do we each in our specific sphere of influence try and add just like a little bit of like a sliver of structural, like, hey, this week we make sure that we look in on these people. Hey, school is starting, like let me make sure that our books in the library or whatever it is have like diversity in them, whatever, like how do we just put little checkpoints in our community that keep that feeling of discomfort for all of us throughout however this pandemic situation lasts.
Yeah, I think that I love that, like sort of the juxtaposition. I feel like we're all sort of talking about the same pieces and just referring it back to our own communities and our own lives, the bringing the outside and bringing it in, and making sure that each person is still feeling the tension, and that it's not only this segment of the community, that like we need to remember that there are lots of people that are still feeling this tension. Look, that's why we're having this conversation, right? I mean, and I want everybody to have some take homes also, and we're gonna do that in a second. But Rav Isaiah, your thoughts on this piece, what people were going through, and how where we've landed sort of now within the JFNA and the different pieces that you bring to the table. What are your thoughts? And I'm going to remind you about muting. Or unmute.
Well done.
I know, because
Listen,
I saw you were about to speak, and I said I got to catch you beforehand.
No, they say that supervision is supervision, to have the foresight. And on that note, I mean, I would say, one, we can't do any of this alone, right? Who we decide, who our people are. Marc, you mentioned that earlier as a question. I think that the journey of the work that's ahead, and to think about what's happening around us in our 21st century, like American Jewish life, um, you know, coping and adapting. That's something that we as a Jewish people have been doing for thousands of years. We've been swimming upstream for thousands of years. We've been adapting and holding paradox and being in between. And in this 21st century, I think what we're facing and what we're seeing is another evolution, revolution of love, hopefully, but seeing another growing phase of what it means to be Jewish, right? And every generation, we're supposed to ask ourselves those questions of what it means to be Jewish. And I think that in looking at the challenges that face America more broadly, Israel, globally, and then also the opportunities, there's so many. I mean, listen, if we already have a plan and strategy for going to Mars, then wow, like there's a lot of other strategies, please God, that we could also develop and work towards when it comes to mitigating, trauma and loneliness and our health or social disparities around race or any other things that we're seeing in our society. So for me, on the note of even grabbing on the Zoom, the vision of, if the question is really about trajectories, is what we're doing today, is what I'm doing today. How is that setting a trajectory for the future, for tomorrow? And Elul, right? Tishrei, this time already is supposed to be about what choices am I making each and every day that's going to propel me, and what kind of direction is that going to propel me in? So I asked that question too for us. Like, I think that the choices that we're able to make, we have huge opportunities. If you look at the Jewish communal ecosystem and organizations and how Jewish engagement functions today, I'm excited. Like, I'm excited by the Gen Zers, let's say, and what kind of models of organized, Jewish organized life is coming to be. I'm a co-founder of the Jewish Youth Climate Movement. It's a teen-led movement. They're the first, I think, probably the first Gen Z-led organization. That really, it's teen-centered from beginning to end in Jewish communal life. And I'm excited about the foresight and the intentionality around the choices that they're making. And it's not just for them. It's not just about the community politics or outdoing another community institution. It's genuinely thinking about, like, are the choices I'm making right now setting up a trajectory for the kind of community I want to be in tomorrow,
Yeah, I think that's great. It's really about making those deliberate choices. I love that. We have the responsibility, each one of us have the responsibility about making those choices to see through to the future, because we need to, and we want to, and it's important. Absolutely. Marc.
Yeah, what jumped to mind for me as Rabbi Isaiah was talking about the supervision is Ezu Chacham Haroat Hanolad, like, who is wise, the one who sees what is being born. And traditionally, it's meant as a metaphor for the new moon, because you have to really look at the sky to really spot it. But I like the text as it is, like that what is being born, and as it's at the start of the process, and as Chava was speaking about movement and about tension and how people still need to feel the tension and discomfort, I could already hear the voice in my head going, but people are already uncomfortable. They just want to be comfortable. Do we need them to experience more tension? And the answer is yes, because this is happening. It's not a question of if, it's a question of when. And either we can start to reckon with it now and build appropriately, or we can try to put our heads back into the ground, and you're going to deal with this later, and it's just going to be that much more challenging. So are we as a community, as Rabbi Isaiah said, are we going to be really wise and look at, well, what is being born out of this? And then recognizing, also continuing that metaphor of the newborn, that maybe we're not going to make the big structural leap now, but we can all, as Avital said, as Chava said, as Rabbi said, okay, so what's a small step that I can take or our community can take to keep moving it forward? And I thought that whole therapy conversation was very amusing to me, because what were we actually talking about? We weren't talking about, oh, here's the medical professional and here's what's pathologized and here's what we need to chat about. We were talking about, can we create an authentic space for 30 seconds for someone to acknowledge, here is a real emotion that I'm feeling in this moment that I can share without judgment with somebody else. And that was a radical act, that I can take off my mask at the moment of communal leader and everything that that means, put it to the side for a bit, and just be a human being with human feelings with other people who get that and accept that. And that doesn't require training. That doesn't require a position of authority. That requires, can I be present with myself and be present with somebody else in this moment? And what's both amazing and incredible and honestly a little bit insane is that that is a radical act. Mm-hmm. And that's something that's open to all of us. And when we're that with ourselves and with others, then we move beyond, as Chava was talking about, the talking points. Then we move beyond, as Avital was saying, of, oh, this person said this person, like, okay, but am I connecting with the person across from me and the humanity of the person across from me? Am I being curious? Am I being empathetic on the level of the interpersonal? So whenever anybody asks, and I know Dr. Barron, you're going in this direction, okay, but what's something practically I can do right now? Okay,
and how did you know that was my next question? Yeah, keep going.
You might have mentioned it before. / we've all been on a couple of panels at this point in the pandemic.
It goes back to the supervision.
Supervision, the NOLAD in this case, but practically what's next? And I think it's Chava's point. Okay, so what's in your sphere of influence? Or the famous Hasidic story that if I don't say it, Rabbi Zaya will share about, I want to change the world, to start with my city, to start with my village, to start with my family, to start with myself. And I think that if we're able to, and Avital modeled this beautifully, like really connect with, okay, where am I right now? What am I experiencing? And can I extend beyond that to what is someone in my family experiencing? And maybe even extend beyond that to what are people in my community experiencing? And how could I give in a small way without judging myself for how big or small it is, but rather think of it more of an on-off. Am I giving, whatever that means? And can I keep doing that and build that muscle and move it forward? I truly believe, and I need to believe as an activist, in the ripple effect. I just need to. Otherwise, there's no doing anything, because most of us aren't going to see the impact until much, much later on. So the question I would ask anyone who's listening, and honestly myself, is, yes, it's easy to get overwhelmed by all that needs to be done, and to stay on Pirkei Avot, lo lecha mecha mikor, lo ata ben chorin libetal mimena. It's not for us to finish, but that doesn't mean we can't start either. So what's that first domino? What's that first step that will keep things in motion, and then we'll build momentum that will keep things moving?
I often get frustrated because people write to me and they say, I can't keep having the same conversation with people who don't understand why it's difficult for me to be around lots of people with kids. I can't keep going to birthday parties and going to weddings and going to bar mitzvahs when everyone else in my family and everyone in my community is pregnant. I can't keep, and I keep saying to them, you don't have to, but if you can find that one person who gets it, or you have one person who feels like they're a safe space for you, then use that person, and hopefully that ripple effect will happen on its own, and that one person, and then there might be a second and a third, and that's how I continue to do this work and educate. But Marc, it's just exactly everything that you said. we are one person and we can only try our best, right? That's what this is about. Okay, I mean, let's bring this home and close it out. So Marc, you already told everyone what they have to answer here. They have to give us the takeaway, the practical takeaway, which you did so beautifully. But if anybody else has anything more to add to this conversation, any other practical or totally impractical things to add to the conversation, I'd love to hear it. Please, anyone here?
I think the thing for me is that often we wait for the person who is experiencing the issue to lead in it, right? To say something, to do something, and then you kind of just like, oh yeah, I agree 100%, right? What would it mean for someone to take that burden off of someone, to say, you know what, I'm really uncomfortable about like the way, like the thing you said or the thing that I'm seeing. Could we not do that? Or to say, not wait for someone to ask you for an invite over and over and over again, but to like say, you know what, I'm going to make it an intention for every Chag to make sure that I reach out to certain people, or to make sure they have a place, to not wait to be called on. I think it's really, it's natural to feel uncomfortable in exercising a muscle about something maybe you don't feel like an expert in, or that you haven't done before. But I think one thing that I try to encourage people to do is to not feel like they have to wait for permission. I think a lot of people are waiting for permission or waiting for instruction. You don't have to wait. You don't have, like, you know, we don't have all of the answers. Community leaders, activists, advocates we don't have all the answers. So you know your community better than I do. You know the people at your Shul better than I do. Maybe there's a way of engaging someone on a certain issue that is more effective than what I tell you. But don't be afraid to, I think, take the first step. I think, you know, you don't have to be given permission, I think.
What are your thoughts also about asking for what you need, in addition to not waiting for the first step? But what about asking for your need? I know you said you don't, like, in your last.
I mean, I think it goes, I think also that is a huge component, right? If you need more resources to feel like you can do something, ask for them. Look, you know, people are happy to help engage. And I think also we as individuals, right, we have to, you know, I always tell people, like, I'm not a mind reader, right? Like, when, you know, like, it happens in relationships, you know, like my husband's like, I'm not a mind reader. Why did you tell me you don't want that? You know, we in communities are also not mind readers. You know, we have to say, you know, this isn't working for me. You know, finding ways to say, this doesn't work. What I would love to see is, can we try this new thing? I'm not sure that I know enough about this. I'd love to have more conversations around this. I'd love for us to do more education around X. I think this is important. That willingness to vocalize what we need, and to vocalize, I think, to speak up, right? We're like, we talk about, I mean, like, Frum Jews don't have a problem talking about anything and everything, right? It was like all of a sudden we have problems with like silence, you know, like if you're in the grocery store and you need this dip, that dip, whatever, you're very clear, like, no, I don't want this hummus, I want that hummus, like, you know. So too with like our emotional needs, our communal needs, we need to say, you know what, this isn't working for me. I need to see this. I need to see that. And I think that that's something that's also important.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Rabbi Zaya, last thoughts.
Yeah, I've been thinking about, instead of looking at the world through dichotomies, right? Either this or that. As the mixture is true, as a Black Jew with white skin, how I feel about my own identity on the inside is not how other people see me. And holding that as like a framework for my own inner psychology is like something that I'll hold for the rest of my life, right? And I'll have to process what my own racial identity is versus how other people see me, right? And so each of us in our own ways are constantly holding multiple truths, right? Multiple realities in our own ways. And one thing that I'm thinking about, and maybe a closing thought, is when it comes to personal change, personal growth, when it comes to communal change and communal growth, I think that it's very easy for us to lean in either direction of a fear-based approach, of a narrative of scarcity, of a fear of what's coming, of the unknown, the uncertainty, the challenges, and all of that is very important, and how we want to change from that fear base. But then there's also a love-based approach, right? A posture of holding myself and saying, whoa, like, I can't even believe I'm still even here breathing. And even though there are all those other things, like what might I be able to still do and still bring into my life? And so around the Chagim, thinking about tshuva ma'ahava or tshuva me'ira, like a love-based approach to return, or a fear-based approach. Another idea about ma'ava or yira is yisurim. Our suffering, is it Yisurim Shel Ava or Yisurim Shel Yira? How am I interpreting what I experience and what I go through? And so in a way that doesn't feel and sound practical, right? It sounds more of like a posture or like an outlook for how I live my life. But I think because so much of what we talked about tonight is like an ongoing journey of trying to like find clarity, and every day restarting again to find clarity. What a gift it would be if we had like a love-based approach to returning to our best selves, or to seeing when there's difficult situations and seeing, okay, how do we turn this? How do we use this? And the person that they give as an example for having a Yisurim Shel Ava, a person who experiences suffering and transforms their suffering, is Yosef. Yosef HaTzadik, this idea of going through what Yosef went through and still being able to constantly evolve and transform. And there is an idea that Mashiach, the days of Mashiach, there's first a Mashiach ben Yosef, in order to really bring and help society heal. That's a Yosef, a mashpir, a healer, right? Also coming from the word crisis, to also be able to sustain, shever, mashpir, this idea. So hopeful that we could bring that love-based approach, that prophetic, that spiritual voice of healing that our generation so much needs.
Amen. Amen. Avital, final thoughts and closing us out here.
Okay, this is a lot of pressure. For me, this is going to sound sort of maybe counterintuitive, but for me, one of the things that I've sort of been kind of sitting with the last months, especially, as it's become clearer that we're not out of this situation as quickly as we thought we would be. There are two things that sort of I've learned to try to internalize. Number one is that actually another young Rebbitzin told this to me, and it helped me a lot. She said, you have to look at people through the lens of basically of trauma. Everyone has gone through some sort of trauma this past year. And the moment she sort of shifted gears and started seeing people in that way, she found she was more compassionate, and not as quick to judge. And I try to use that, where in any setting, really, I think, and, people of all backgrounds and all experiences have experienced something extremely difficult, and it certainly affected them a year later. So I try to incorporate that in my own, attempt to be compassionate and more sensitive, number one. And number two, I've sort of been like weirdly accepting that, if someone's not ready to come out and come back to social life, like, it's okay. Like they'll get there eventually. I think human nature is strong enough that eventually they'll come to that point. But sort of learning to just honor that, and not pushing people out. And God knows that I have days where I'm certainly like really happy to stay home and not socialize with anyone myself. Yeah, Marc, you agree. So I think it's important that we recognize that, and that it's okay. I think we're sort of, as a society, we're so focused on being so social as a Jewish community, and that there's so much, of course there's value in it, but some people, especially if they're experiencing trauma, are just not ready, and that's really okay, and they will get there.
Beautiful. I think it's really a very beautiful way of approaching it, because I think many of us, it's back to sort of your comment of the, Hilchos Corona, of the being machmir versus makil, and, people, if you're not holding exactly the way you are, then we tend to be judgmental, and sort of taking this, like, everyone's been through trauma, and we all need to respect people where they are. I think it's a really beautiful way of looking at things. Look, Marc, I think what you said in the chat is really the way I'd like to just close this out here. We hereby grant all of you the official permission and personalized invitations to get involved. Like, we can't do this alone. This conversation was not meant to happen in a vacuum. It was meant to just, continue the conversations, some conversations that have already been happening, and just lead all of you to have your own conversations. We're a community. We yes, as Avital was saying, like, some of us are still not ready to come back, or need that time away, and need our aloneness, but eventually we do come back to community. And when we come back, we want to feel that we're being enveloped, and that people care about us, and we want that sensitivity and compassion. So that's what this conversation was. So I thank all of you for being here. Avital Chizhik-Goldschmidt, Marc Fein, Rabbi Rothstein, and Chava Shervington, thank you all for sharing your wisdom and your Torah with us. And we wish all of you a kasiva v'chasima tova, and may these conversations just spark your own journey and your own path into the new year. And we're sending you all big hugs. Okay. Good night, everybody. Shana tova.
Thank you. Shana tova.
Thank you. Hag sameach. Much love.